The early morning Phoenix sun cast long shadows across the tarmac as Sarah Chen pulled into the employee parking lot of Desert Sky Airways, her white Honda Civic looking particularly small next to the massive SUVs and pickup trucks surrounding it. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the steering wheel, not from fear, but from an electric mixture of excitement and anxiety that coursed through her veins. Today was it. After 8 years of military service, countless combat missions, and a reputation that preceded her through the Navy's fighter pilot community, she was stepping into the civilian aviation world. Everything she'd worked for, sacrificed for, was about to begin. She'd chosen the call sign Falcon years ago during her first week of Navy flight training. Her instructor, a grizzled veteran named Commander Hayes, had watched her execute a maneuver so sharp and precise that he'd simply nodded and said, "Falcon, fast, accurate, deadly." The name stuck. Through her entire military career, Falcon meant something. It meant respect, competence, and an almost supernatural ability to read an aircraft's behavior and anticipate problems before they happened. Fellow pilots sought her out on dangerous missions. Younger pilots idolized her. Enemy forces learned to fear the call sign, but all of that evaporated the moment she signed her civilian contract. Sarah stepped out of her car, adjusting her new commercial airline uniform in the reflection of her window. The navy blue jacket felt stiff, almost foreign compared to her worn flight suit. Her captain's insignia gleamed, 4 gold stripes that announced her rank but somehow felt like they were from a different life. She'd worked her entire career for this rank, and yet sitting in a commercial cockpit felt different. Less about combat, strategy, and survival. More about routine, schedules, and passenger comfort. Still, it was flying. It was command, and she was determined to be exceptional at it. The crew room at Desert Sky Airways was a revelation, and not a pleasant one. Sarah walked in at 6:47 a.m. for her 7:15 a.m. briefing, wanting to arrive early and make a good impression. The room was lined with worn leather chairs, a battered coffee machine that smelled like it hadn't been cleaned since 1987, and a wall covered with laminated safety procedures and outdated company policies. A dozen pilots were scattered throughout, most reading newspapers or checking their phones. They barely looked up as she entered. Captain Harold Morrison was the first to acknowledge her, though acknowledge wasn't quite the right word. He was a bear of a man, probably 62, with weathered skin and the kind of permanent scowl that suggested life had disappointed him regularly. He sat in the corner, holding court with 3 other senior captains, all of whom were old enough to remember when women weren't welcome in cockpits at all. Morrison glanced at Sarah, his gray eyes assessing her with the kind of look a rancher might give a new animal at auction. "New hire?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "Captain Sarah Chen," she replied warmly, walking toward him with her hand extended. "First day with the company, excited to be on board." The moment she mentioned her name, she watched something shift in Morrison's expression. His eyes narrowed. One of the other captains, a thin man with a prominent nose, actually smirked. Sarah's hand hung in the air for a second before Morrison finally shook it, his grip deliberately firm in that way men sometimes use to establish dominance. "Chen," he repeated, "you military?" "Navy, 8 years carrier operations mostly, FA-18 Super Hornets." The room went slightly quieter. Even Morrison seemed to register this information, though his expression didn't exactly soften. He nodded curtly and released her hand. Sarah felt the first small victory. She'd established her credentials. She had serious flying hours. She had combat experience. She belonged here. "I'm going to grab a coffee and review the flight plan," Sarah said pleasantly. "Glad to meet you all." She turned toward the coffee station, trying not to show how pleased she was with herself. The conversation behind her resumed almost immediately. She could hear Morrison's gravelly voice, the other captain's responses. She was pouring her coffee when she heard it. "I'm Falcon," someone said, a mockery of her voice. Then came the laughter. sharp, male, dismissive. Sarah froze, the coffee pot suspended in midair. Her mind replayed the moment. She'd told them about her call sign. During the briefing, she'd introduced herself formally. "I'm Captain Sarah Chen, call sign Falcon." It was standard procedure for pilots to use call signs. It made radio communication clearer, helped build camaraderie, established identity. In the Navy, it was a mark of respect earned through performance. She'd spoken it matter-of-factly, without arrogance, simply as part of who she was. "More like Sparrow," Morrison's voice boomed. "Smaller, prettier, less impressive." The laughter that followed felt like acid in her chest. Her coffee cup suddenly felt unbearably heavy. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to confront them, to remind them that she had more combat hours than most of them had total flying hours. She wanted to list her qualifications, detail her achievements, explain the weight that name carried in the military aviation community. She wanted to tell them that Falcon had been earned in ways they couldn't comprehend. But she didn't. Instead, Sarah slowly poured her coffee, set down the pot with deliberate care, and turned to face the room. She made eye contact with Morrison for exactly 2 seconds, enough to acknowledge she'd heard, not enough to look intimidated, then carried her cup to the briefing table and sat down with perfect posture. Her jaw was clenched so tight it ached. Her hands wanted to shake, so she pressed them flat against the table. The briefing began at 7:15 a.m. sharp. Flight 247, Phoenix to Denver, 156 passengers, clear weather all the way, smooth conditions expected. Sarah listened to every word, asked intelligent questions, reviewed the weather maps and route with meticulous attention. She was perfectly professional, perfectly competent, perfectly invisible. The other captains gradually accepted her presence, though Morrison kept shooting her glances that suggested he found her either amusing or irritating, possibly both. As the briefing concluded and pilots began gathering their materials, Sarah remained seated, her captain's hat resting on the table in front of her. One of the younger first officers, probably in his 30s, approached her hesitantly. "Don't let Morrison get to you," he said quietly so the others couldn't hear. "He says stuff like that to everyone, especially new hires. It's his thing." Sarah looked at the first officer, his name tag read Jeff Martinez, and saw genuine sympathy in his eyes. She smiled, though it felt tired. "Thanks for the heads up. I'll be fine." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the crew room for another minute. She pulled out her phone and looked at a photo she kept there, herself in flight suit, standing in front of an FA-18, grinning widely, Falcon stitched clearly on her chest. In that photo, the name meant everything. In this room, it meant nothing. But that was about to change. 3 years. That's how long Sarah Chen promised herself she would remain silent. 3 years of proving herself without demanding recognition. 3 years of excellence so consistent, so undeniable, that eventually even the skeptics would have to acknowledge her competence. She'd made this bargain with herself on the drive home from her first day at Desert Sky Airways, her hands still shaking with suppressed anger, her mind replaying Morrison's mockery over and over. But as she watched the Arizona sunset bleed orange and pink across the sky, she'd made a decision. She wouldn't fight them with words. She'd fight them with performance. The second flight was better in a way. Sarah was assigned to fly with a first officer named Robert Chen, no relation, though they joked about it during pre-flight. Robert was competent but nervous, clearly intimidated by having a new captain, especially one who just transferred from military service. Sarah immediately put him at ease, walking him through her procedures not as a commander but as a mentor. "I'm going to do things by the book," she told him. "Not because I don't trust you, but because safety is everything. We're going to be the best prepared crew in the sky." Robert had relaxed visibly. By the time they pushed back, he was confident and engaged. That flight was smooth, routine, perfect. Sarah landed so gently that passengers applauded. In the crew room afterward, none of the senior captains mentioned it, but Robert shook her hand and said, "I want to fly with you again. That's how flying should feel." It was a small victory, invisible to everyone but them, but Sarah felt it settle into her bones like evidence. This was possible. Excellence was possible. Weeks turned into months. Sarah established a routine that bordered on obsessive. She arrived an hour early for every flight, regardless of whether she needed to. She conducted pre-flight checks that exceeded minimum requirements, crawling under the aircraft, visually inspecting every panel, running diagnostics twice. She studied weather patterns, memorized runway specifications for every airport on her route, and read accident reports the way some people read novels. Her apartment became a library of aviation knowledge. Crash analysis books, emergency procedure manuals, meteorology texts, and a leather-bound journal where she recorded observations about aircraft behavior, lessons learned, and mental notes about decision-making under pressure. Her colleagues began to notice, though not always positively. Captain Morrison commented once during a briefing, "Chen spends more time on pre-flight than she does in the air. Overkill, if you ask me." But Jeff Martinez, who'd become a regular first officer, defended her quietly. "That's why she's never had a single incident report. That's why passengers love flying with her. That's not overkill, that's professionalism." The passenger feedback became Sarah's invisible armor. In her first 3 months, she received 47 compliment cards submitted directly to the airline. Passengers praised her calm demeanor, her smooth flying, her professionalism. The comments cards piled up in a drawer in her apartment, tangible evidence that she was doing something right, even if the old guard wasn't acknowledging it. She never mentioned them to anyone. She didn't need to. The evidence would speak for itself eventually. By month 6, Sarah had noticed something interesting. The first officers actually wanted to fly with her. There was an informal sign-up sheet in the crew room where pilots could request specific captains or first officers. Sarah's name started appearing with unusual frequency. Young pilots wanted to learn from her. Experienced first officers wanted to fly with someone they trusted completely. One young female first officer, Amanda Martinez, actually pulled her aside after a flight and said, "You're why I didn't quit. I was ready to leave this industry, thought I wasn't cut out for it. But flying with you, seeing how you handle everything, reminding me it's possible. Thank you." Sarah had hugged her, unable to speak without her voice breaking. The turning point came during year 2. Sarah was assigned to fly with Captain Morrison himself, a 4-day trip to Denver, Chicago, and back. She was terrified, though she'd never show it. Morrison was the hierarchy, the unofficial leader of the old guard. If he respected her, everything would change. If he didn't, the 3-year clock would reset. The first flight was Denver to Chicago. Straightforward, beautiful weather, nothing complicated. Sarah flew it conservatively but precisely. Smooth takeoff, textbook climb, perfect descent. She didn't show off or try to impress. She simply flew like she always did, competently, safely, with absolute attention to detail. When they landed and Morrison walked out of the cockpit without comment, Sarah felt a flutter of disappointment. But something had shifted. On the layover in Chicago, Morrison sat next to her at dinner with several other pilots. He didn't speak to her directly, but she caught him listening intently when she discussed approach procedures with a younger captain. The next morning, as they prepared for the return flight, Morrison actually nodded at her during briefing, a small gesture but loaded with meaning. That flight, something unexpected happened. They encountered unexpected turbulence over Ohio, sudden, violent, the kind of thing that makes experienced pilots sit up straighter. Sarah had already anticipated it, adjusting their route slightly before ATC even mentioned it. The adjustment was so smooth that passengers barely noticed, but Morrison noticed. When they landed in Phoenix, he looked at her for a long moment and said quietly, "Good anticipation back there, Chen." It was 3 words. Not a compliment exactly, more of an observation. But it was respect, and Sarah had seen it register in his eyes. That night, she sat in her apartment and cried, not from sadness, but from the release of 2 years of suppressed frustration and effort finally being acknowledged. By the end of year 2, Sarah's safety record was impeccable. Not a single incident report, not one emergency declared, not one passenger complaint. She'd mentored 7 first officers, all of whom had specifically requested her as a trainer. Her weather instincts were becoming legendary. Other pilots would mention that thing Chen does where she anticipates bad weather. And her landing technique was being used in training videos, though her name wasn't on them. The third year felt different. Sarah still maintained her relentless standards, still arrived early, still studied obsessively. But now when she walked into the crew room, younger pilots greeted her. When she introduced herself on new flights, first officers visibly relaxed. They'd heard the name, the reputation. Morrison had stopped his dismissive comments entirely. Sometimes she caught him watching her during briefings, as if reassessing his initial judgment. It was invisible to the outside world. There were no promotions, no special announcements, no fanfare. But Sarah knew the truth. She transformed from the woman they'd mocked to someone they respected. She'd done it without demanding anything, without drawing attention to herself, without making a fuss. She'd simply been excellent, consistently and quietly, day after day, flight after flight. On the anniversary of her first day, Sarah flew a routine trip to Denver and back. Nothing special, nothing dramatic. Just another day of perfect flying, perfect professionalism, perfect execution. As she walked out of the airport, she checked her phone and found an email from the chief pilot. Noticed your safety record. Would you be interested in training captain position? Starting next month. Sarah smiled. The Falcon was no longer invisible. She just hadn't needed anyone's permission to know it. February 14th, 2022. Valentine's Day. Sarah Chen woke at 4:30 a.m. to the sound of her alarm, though she'd been lying awake for 20 minutes already, that familiar pre-flight restlessness that had plagued her since her Navy days. She lay in bed for another moment, listening to the pre-dawn silence of Phoenix, feeling the cool Arizona morning air slip through the window she always left slightly open. Today was a standard flight. Flight 447, Phoenix Sky Harbor International to Denver International, scheduled departure 7:15 a.m. A milk run, as the pilots called it. Routine, predictable, safe. But Sarah never approached any flight as routine. She rose, showered, and went through her morning ritual with methodical precision. Coffee black, no sugar, toast with almond butter. A quick review of the weather forecast on her laptop. Clear skies all the way, slight winds aloft, nothing concerning. She pulled on her uniform, which by now felt less like a costume and more like a second skin. The captain's insignia caught the bathroom light as she adjusted her tie. 3 years in this seat, and she still felt a small jolt of pride every time she saw those 4 gold stripes. Her phone buzzed at 6:00 a.m. A text from Jeff Martinez. Looking forward to flying with you today, Captain. Good to get back in the sky. Jeff had taken 2 weeks off for family matters and was returning to flying today. Sarah smiled. Jeff was one of her favorite first officers, competent, calm, and genuinely passionate about aviation. They had exceptional chemistry in the cockpit, the kind of unspoken communication that came from flying together frequently enough to anticipate each other's moves. The drive to Sky Harbor was uneventful. Phoenix was already beginning to stir, early commuters on the highway, the city waking up to another desert day. Sarah thought briefly about the Valentine's Day angle. The flight was fuller than usual, probably couples heading to Denver for romantic mountain getaways. She'd heard someone in the crew room mention that hotels in Aspen were booked solid. She wondered if anyone on her flight was proposing today. If there were engagement rings in carry-on luggage, if this was a special day for people who would remember it for the rest of their lives. She arrived at the airport at 6:15 a.m., 45 minutes before her scheduled briefing. The parking lot was quiet, mostly maintenance vehicles and early shift ground crew. She made her way through the employee entrance with her crew badge, nodding to a familiar security guard who'd learned to recognize her by sight. "Morning, Captain Chen. Beautiful day today," he said cheerfully. Sarah agreed, though she barely heard him. Her mind was already shifting into flight mode, that particular mental state where everything else fell away and there was only the upcoming mission. The crew room was nearly empty at 6:30 a.m. Only a couple of overnight flight crews were still there, tired and heading home. Sarah pulled up the flight plan on the computer system and began her study of the day's route. Phoenix to Denver, 320 nautical miles, approximately 2 hours and 10 minutes flight time. Cruising altitude would be 31,000 feet. The aircraft assigned to Flight 447 was a Boeing 737-800, tail number N2-847B, a regional jet that Sarah had flown dozens of times. According to the maintenance logs, the aircraft had just completed a major inspection. Everything was in excellent condition. Jeff arrived at 6:50 a.m. looking refreshed and genuinely happy to be back. They greeted each other warmly, and Sarah immediately briefed him on the flight plan. The official crew briefing would happen at 7:15 with the flight attendants and the second officer, but Sarah always gave Jeff a personal briefing first, a habit she developed years ago that set the tone for their flight together. They discussed weather, potential turbulence, emergency procedures, and Sarah's expectations for the flight. Jeff listened intently, asking clarifying questions, confirming procedures. By the time the official briefing began, they were already perfectly aligned. At 7:15 a.m. sharp, Sarah stood before the entire crew, Jeff, Captain Thomas Rodriguez, the second officer, and the 4 flight attendants who would be serving the passengers. Her briefing was professional and thorough, touching on weather, turbulence, passenger count, 156 people, as she'd noted earlier, and a reminder about the recent changes to emergency equipment locations. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would suggest this would be anything other than a perfectly ordinary February morning. "Any questions?" Sarah asked. No one raised a hand. "Excellent, let's make it a good flight." The walk to the aircraft at 6:55 a.m. was where Sarah always felt that particular magic of aviation. The 737 sat gleaming in the early morning sun, all polished aluminum and purpose. She approached it the way she always did, not rushing, not careless, but with the reverence of someone entering sacred space. This aircraft was going to carry 156 human beings into the sky, and every single one of them was trusting her with their lives. It was a responsibility she never took lightly. The pre-flight inspection began at 7:00 a.m. Sarah walked the exterior of the aircraft with methodical attention, checking landing gear, wings, fuselage, engine cowlings. She ran her hands along the skin, feeling for any irregularities. She checked hydraulic fluid levels, verified the landing gear position, inspected the tail. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as it should be. In the cockpit, she and Jeff began their systems check, a lengthy process that verified every single system on the aircraft was functional and ready. They checked the engines, hydraulics, electrical systems, navigation systems, and emergency equipment. Jeff called out items. Sarah verified them. Back and forth, a rhythm they'd perfected through hundreds of flights together. The second officer, Thomas, assisted with additional checks. Everything was nominal, perfect in fact. By 7:45 a.m. they were ready for pushback. Sarah called ground control and requested permission to push back from the gate. Approved. The ground crew connected the tug, and the aircraft began moving backward, away from the terminal toward the runway. Passengers were settled in their seats, having gone through the safety briefing. Sarah could imagine them, the couples excited about Denver, the business travelers checking emails, the families with children already becoming restless. She keyed the radio and called for taxi clearance. Ground control responded with a runway assignment and a reminder to watch for crosswind conditions. Sarah acknowledged and began taxiing toward the runway, feeling the aircraft's weight beneath her, that perfect coordination of her hands on the yoke and the aircraft's response. The climb out from Phoenix Sky Harbor was smooth and beautiful. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, gathering speed, and then, that moment where the wheels left the earth and the aircraft became a bird. Sarah felt it every time, that magical instant of transition. They were flying. The aircraft climbed steadily, banking slightly to the northeast, toward Denver, toward a routine flight that would take about 2 hours. At 8:00 a.m., as the aircraft leveled out at cruise altitude of 31,000 feet, Sarah settled into that relaxed vigilance that characterized professional flying. She monitored the instruments, scanned the sky, felt the aircraft's rhythm. Jeff was equally calm, occasionally making small adjustments. Everything was perfect. Everything was absolutely perfect. 30 minutes later, everything would change forever. The Mayday declaration echoed through the radio, a formal announcement that transformed Flight 447 from a routine commercial flight into an emergency. But inside the cockpit, there was only silence, the focused, intense silence of two pilots operating at the absolute peak of their training and capability. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency across the control panel, her eyes tracking multiple instruments simultaneously, her brain processing information faster than most people could consciously articulate thoughts. "Left engine, confirm fire," she commanded, her voice steady despite the aircraft bucking beneath her like a mechanical bull. The shaking was getting worse, a violent vibration that made her teeth chatter slightly. Jeff's face had gone pale, but his training overrode his fear. "Confirmed. Temperature still climbing. We're losing hydraulic pressure in the left system." His voice wavered on the last word, fear creeping in despite his best efforts to suppress it. Behind them in the cabin, chaos was erupting. Passengers were screaming. A child was crying, a high-pitched wail that cut through the mechanical shudder of the damaged aircraft. A flight attendant stumbled down the aisle, gripping seats for balance. Overhead luggage compartments had sprung open, spilling carry-ons into the aisles. But Sarah couldn't afford to think about any of that. Her entire universe had contracted to the size of the cockpit, to the instruments glowing in front of her, to the critical calculations her mind was performing in real time. The left engine wasn't just failing, it was catastrophically failing. She could see it in the data: metal temperatures off the scale, oil pressure dropping, vibration readings spiking beyond normal limits. Something inside that engine had come apart. Metal fragments were likely tearing through the engine housing, potentially damaging hydraulic lines, fuel systems, even the wing itself. This wasn't a controlled descent to the nearest airport. This was a wounded animal, and she had to decide how to put it down before it killed everyone aboard. "Shut down left engine," Sarah ordered, already knowing Jeff would be executing the procedure. He switched off the fuel selector, killed the ignition, and began the emergency shutdown sequence with trembling hands. The vibration didn't stop immediately. It took another agonizing 10 seconds for the damaged engine to wind down, the roar becoming a whine, then a groan, then silence. But even with the engine shut down, the aircraft was still severely compromised. The shaking continued, just slightly less violent, just slightly more manageable. "Good," Sarah said, though nothing about this situation was good. She was flying a damaged aircraft with one functioning engine, losing hydraulic pressure, and 156 people depending on her to get them to the ground alive. The responsibility crashed down on her like a physical weight, pressing on her chest, making it hard to breathe. But she'd trained for this. Every emergency procedure, every simulator scenario, every nightmare about worst-case situations, it all pointed to this single moment. She needed to make a decision, now. The radio crackled. "Flight 447, this is ATC. We've cleared all traffic in your vicinity. What is your status and intentions?" Sarah keyed the radio, her mind already racing through options. Dubuque Regional Airport was 40 miles away, approximately 15 minutes at their current descent rate. Denver International was 90 miles away, probably 45 minutes if the aircraft could hold together that long. Dubuque had a shorter runway, limited emergency equipment, a smaller airport not equipped for major emergency operations. Denver had everything: full crash response capabilities, longer runways, a major medical center, every resource imaginable. But could the aircraft survive 45 minutes? Sarah looked at the hydraulic pressure gauges. The left system was dropping steadily. The right system was still functional but showing signs of stress. If she lost the right system, she'd be flying on minimal hydraulic power, using the manual reversion system that every pilot trained for but hoped never to use. Flying a 737 on manual control was possible, theoretically, but it was exhausting, imprecise, and incredibly dangerous. If she could reach Dubuque before losing the second hydraulic system, she could make the landing. If she pushed for Denver and lost hydraulics halfway there, she'd be fighting a nearly uncontrollable aircraft over a populated area. The decision took 3 seconds. ATC, Flight 447, were diverting to Dubuque Regional. Request direct routing and emergency equipment standing by. The moment she said it, she knew it was right. Every instinct screamed rightness. This was the call, trust it, own it. Copy that, Flight 447, diverting to Dubuque, emergency equipment being called now. Runway 27 is clear for your arrival. Sarah began configuring the aircraft for emergency descent. She reduced power on the remaining engine carefully. Too much reduction, and the aircraft would become hard to control. Too little and they'd reach Dubuque too high, requiring a steep descent that stressed the structure. She had to balance competing dangers, dance on the knife's edge between multiple catastrophic failures. Flaps, she called out. 5 degrees, Jeff responded, moving the flap lever. The aircraft's nose dipped slightly as they began losing altitude. Sarah monitored the descent rate, crucial to maintain control without stressing the airframe. Then she did something that required more courage than any combat maneuver she'd ever executed. She switched to the passenger intercom. The cabin had descended into fearful silence when the engine shutdown quieted the violent shaking. Passengers were praying, crying, holding hands. When they heard their captain's voice, the sound of absolute authority and calm certainty, something shifted. This woman wasn't panicking. This woman had a plan. Passengers, this is your captain speaking. Sarah kept her voice level, confident, utterly devoid of fear despite the adrenaline flooding her system. We are experiencing an engine failure. This is a manageable situation. We are diverting to Dubuque Regional Airport where we will make an emergency landing. I want you to know that your safety is my absolute priority, and my crew is trained and prepared for exactly this scenario. We will land safely. I will see you all on the ground. She didn't mention the hydraulic pressure loss. She didn't mention the possibility of more failures. She didn't mention the worst-case scenarios playing out in her mind. She simply radiated confidence and certainty because these people needed to know they were going to survive. And more than that, Sarah needed to believe it herself, needed that confidence to fuel her decision-making. The aircraft continued its descent, bleeding altitude at a steady rate. Sarah tracked their position, mentally calculating fuel remaining, glide paths, descent angles. Dubuque appeared on the horizon, a thin strip of gray concrete against the brown earth, emergency vehicles already racing into position. The runway looked impossibly short from this altitude, impossibly narrow. She had to land this aircraft with one engine, questionable hydraulics, and a structure that might be compromised by engine debris. She could do this. She had to do this. Every technical skill she possessed, every ounce of experience, every moment of training converged into singular focus. Sarah Chen, Falcon, was about to prove why she'd earned that name. 5,000 feet, Jeff called out, his voice steadier now that he was focused on procedures rather than fear. Acknowledged, Sarah responded. The runway was growing larger, more defined. She could see the foam trucks, the ambulances, the fire engines. She could see Dubuque preparing to receive her damaged aircraft and her frightened passengers. Sarah made the final micro-adjustments to the descent path, positioning the aircraft perfectly, trusting her instincts, trusting her training, trusting herself completely. 3,000 feet, Jeff whispered. Sarah's hands were steady on the yoke. Her mind was clear. Her purpose was absolute. They were going to land this aircraft safely. And everyone was going home. The wheels of Flight 447 touched down on Dubuque Regional Airport's runway at 8:47 a.m., and within seconds, the aircraft was surrounded by a constellation of emergency vehicles, fire trucks spraying foam, ambulances positioned strategically, police cars with lights flashing. The impact of the landing was hard enough to register the emergency with ATC, but not so hard as to cause additional injuries. Sarah had landed it perfectly, precisely, with the kind of control that shouldn't have been possible given the aircraft's condition. Inside the cabin, passengers erupted in applause and cheers. Some were crying openly tears of relief, tears of gratitude, tears of the profound shock that comes from facing mortality and surviving. Flight attendants embraced each other. A man in 14C was on his knees, hands clasped in prayer. An elderly woman kept repeating, "Thank God, thank God, thank God." In the cockpit, Sarah and Jeff sat motionless for a moment, letting the reality of what they'd accomplished settle over them. Then Sarah keyed the radio one final time. Flight 447, wheels down, all passengers safe. The phrase would echo across the internet within 24 hours. The audio recording of Flight 447's emergency was automatically saved by ATC, a standard procedure that captured every radio communication between the aircraft and ground control. Within hours, as the incident reports were filed, and the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, began their investigation, the recording was transferred to secure servers. But in the era of digital information sharing, recordings didn't stay secure for long. That evening, aviation enthusiast forums had the audio. By the next morning, it was on YouTube, posted by an aviation blogger named Marcus Chen, no relation to Sarah, who'd obtained it through FOIA Freedom of Information Act request database access. His channel had about 15,000 subscribers, mostly serious aviation professionals and enthusiasts. He posted it with minimal commentary. Emergency landing at Dubuque Real ATC Audio, February 14, 2022. Within 12 hours, the video had 200,000 views. The comments section exploded with analysis from professional pilots. "This is textbook emergency management," wrote a retired Air Force pilot. "Notice how she immediately declared Mayday, providing clear, concise information without panic." Another commenter, a current airline captain, wrote, "I've been flying for 30 years, and I would be proud to execute an emergency this well. She made the right decision on divert timing, the right call on descent profile, perfect communication with crew. This is what excellence looks like." Aviation blogs picked it up next. Flight Radar 24's Twitter account shared the recording with the caption, "Remarkable composure and professionalism during emergency descent. This is what pilot training is designed for." Within 24 hours, the video had crossed 1 million views. News outlets began calling the Dubuque airport, requesting interviews. Local reporters showed up at the airport seeking passengers who'd been on the flight. But the real explosion came when someone, a journalist at the Des Moines Register, dug deeper into Sarah Chen's background and discovered the crew room recording from her first day. The raw audio file was obtained from a passenger who'd been recording a podcast during the briefing, capturing ambient sounds. The clip was only 45 seconds long, but it was devastatingly perfect. Sarah's voice, introducing herself confidently, "I'm Captain Sarah Chen, call St. Falcon." Then the sharp sound of laughter. Then Captain Morrison's unmistakable voice, more like Sparrow. The juxtaposition was irresistible. A Twitter account with 3 million followers posted both audio clips side by side. At Sky Harbor Airways pilot Sarah Chen introduces herself as Falcon on day one. Colleagues mock her. 3 years later, she lands a crippled aircraft with 156 people aboard, keeping everyone safe through perfect execution under extreme pressure. This is the story of proving yourself. The tweet went viral. Within hours, it had 500,000 retweets. Within a day, it had 2 million. The narrative was too compelling, too perfect. A woman dismissed by her peers, quietly proving her worth through excellence, then spectacularly validating her confidence in the most dramatic circumstances imaginable. News organizations that had covered the emergency as a technical aviation story suddenly pivoted to a human interest angle. Local pilot Sarah Chen saves 156 lives became woman pilot ridiculed by colleagues performs emergency landing of a lifetime became the Falcon flies, how a dismissed captain became a hero. CNN ran a segment. Fox News invited aviation experts to analyze the audio. The story spread beyond aviation circle into mainstream consciousness. Sarah's phone wouldn't stop ringing. She was back at her apartment in Phoenix, still in shock from the previous day's events, when the first wave of media requests started arriving. News outlets wanted interviews. Morning shows wanted her on camera. A documentary producer called, asking about exclusive rights to her story. Late-night comedians made jokes about Falcon proving the haters wrong. Twitter was filled with memes comparing her composure to dramatic disaster movies. Sarah sat on her couch, scrolling through the endless social media posts, watching strangers dissect the audio of the most intense moment of her life, reading comments from people who'd never met her declaring her a hero or feminist icon or proof that women belonged in the cockpit. It was overwhelming. It was surreal. It was everything she'd worked for and nothing she'd expected. What struck her most were the messages from other women. Young women in flight schools wrote, "You're why I didn't quit." Women in male-dominated industries shared, "Your story gave me courage to keep going." Female pilots commented, "Finally, someone who shows what we're capable of." The impact rippled beyond aviation into broader conversations about women in leadership, about perseverance, about the cost of proving yourself to people who'd already made up their minds. But Sarah also saw the backlash. Some people accused her of playing the victim card. Others suggested the media was making too big a deal out of her doing her job. A few commenters claimed she'd been lucky, that any competent pilot could have made that landing. One particularly vicious post suggested her military background had been oversold and questioned whether she actually deserved her position. None of it mattered. Because the people who mattered, the actual experts, the professional pilots, the aviation safety community, had spoken. This wasn't luck. This wasn't competence. This was excellence under catastrophic pressure. This was exactly what 30 years of training across military and civilian aviation was supposed to produce. Captain Morrison called her personally, his gravelly voice awkward with apology. "Chen, we owe you an apology. I was wrong about you. We all were." Sarah accepted graciously, though she felt nothing, neither anger nor satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement of the obvious truth she'd always known, that she was exactly as good as she'd claimed on day one. The most profound moment came when a first officer she'd never met approached her in the crew room. The young woman, probably in her late 20s, had tears in her eyes. "I was going to leave aviation," she said. "I'd been told I wasn't good enough, that I didn't belong in the cockpit. But watching what you did, hearing how you handled that emergency, it reminded me that I get to decide who I am, not the people trying to discourage me. Thank you." Sarah hugged her and finally, she understood the real weight of what had happened. She wasn't just a pilot who'd landed an airplane. She was proof that excellence, sustained across years of quiet determination, could silence every critic, could overcome every obstacle, could transform the world's perception of what was possible. She was Falcon. And the whole world finally knew it. Sarah Chen walked into Desert Sky Airways crew room on Monday, February 21st, 2022, exactly 1 week after the emergency landing, and the silence that greeted her was profound and complete. Every pilot in the room looked up. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. She felt the weight of their collective gaze like a physical force, and for a moment, she was transported back to her first day, when those same faces had looked at her with dismissal and barely concealed contempt. But everything had changed. Captain Morrison stood up. Sarah watched him rise from the worn leather chair where he'd held court for years, watched him cross the room toward her with an expression she'd never seen on his weathered face, genuine contrition. The other senior captains followed his lead, standing as well, a small gesture, almost absurdly formal, but Sarah understood its weight. These men had spent years maintaining a hierarchy where women pilots occupied a lower rank, regardless of their actual competence. Now that hierarchy was crumbling. "Captain Chen," Morrison said, extending his hand. "I owe you an apology, we all do. You were right about who you are and we were wrong about you. I hope you can forgive us." Sarah shook his hand firmly. She could have made this moment about triumph, could have leveraged it to express every ounce of frustration from 3 years of dismissal and mockery. Instead, she simply nodded and said, "Thank you for that. I appreciate it." Then she moved past him to the coffee station, her movements calm and measured. But inside, something was shifting. The anger she'd been carrying, the carefully suppressed fury that had fueled her excellence, was beginning to transform into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of indifference. Their opinion no longer mattered. It had never truly mattered. What mattered was that she knew who she was, that her colleagues now had to accept that reality, and that this moment belonged to her to use however she chose. The next few days were surreal. The airline held a formal ceremony in the Sky Harbor Crew Lounge, with company executives, local media, and even a representative from the FAA in attendance. Sarah was presented with a commendation, a heavy plaque with her name engraved, citing her exemplary professionalism during an emergency situation. The CEO of Desert Sky Airways, a woman named Patricia Winters, stood beside Sarah and made a brief speech about safety culture and the kind of pilots the airline was proud to employ. "Captain Chen represents the absolute best of professional aviation," Winters said. "Her quick decision-making, her composure under pressure, and her flawless execution saved 156 lives. She is exactly the captain I want flying my aircraft." Sarah smiled for the cameras, accepted the applause, and felt oddly detached from the entire proceedings. This was wonderful, certainly. This was validation. But it was also theater, a corporate gesture designed to manage public relations and communicate the airline's commitment to safety. The real recognition had come 3 years ago, from the first officer who'd asked to fly with her again. The real validation had come from passengers who'd written compliment cards and first officers who'd sought her out specifically. The media requests intensified. Morning shows in Denver, Phoenix, and Chicago wanted her for interviews. A documentary filmmaker reached out about telling her story. Publishing houses contacted her about writing a memoir. Sarah turned most of them down. She did agree to a few carefully selected interviews. CBS's Aviation Correspondent, a podcast about women in aviation, a local news segment, but she was deliberate about her message. She never positioned herself as a victim of her colleagues' dismissal. She never complained about the mockery. Instead, she focused on procedures, training, decision-making, and the importance of preparation. "Any pilot with proper training can execute emergency procedures," she explained during one interview. "The difference between a good landing and a great one is preparation and mindset. I studied these scenarios because I wanted to be ready, not because I expected to face them. That preparation made the difference." When the interviewer tried to bring up the sparrow comment from her first day, Sarah gently redirected. "What interests me isn't past criticism. What interests me is how we train pilots to handle extreme situations. That's the story worth telling." 2 weeks after the incident, Sarah received a call from Patricia Winters. "I'd like to talk to you about a promotion," the CEO said. "We're looking for a new director of safety training. Your experience, military background, emergency procedures expertise, and now this, makes you perfect for the position. It would mean leaving regular flight duty, but you'd be training the next generation of pilots." interested. Sarah thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. I want to continue flying, she said. I love flying, but I'm very interested in training. Could we design a hybrid role? I keep my captain status and continue flying, but also develop and teach emergency procedures training. Winters laughed. I like the way you think. Let me see what we can work out. The hybrid position was finalized within a month. Sarah would maintain her captain rating and fly approximately 15 hours per week, but would spend the rest of her time developing training materials, teaching other pilots, and consulting on safety procedures. It was the perfect role. She got to fly, to stay sharp, to continue doing what she loved, while also leveraging her expertise to improve the entire safety culture of the airline. Her first training class was taught 3 weeks after she returned to regular flying. 16 first officers and junior captains sat in the conference room, most of them watching her with obvious interest. Sarah knew that several had specifically requested to be in her training session. They wanted to learn from the woman who'd landed a crippled aircraft and kept everyone alive. She didn't use that as her teaching point. Instead, she broke down the decision-making process, the specific calculations she'd made, the alternative options she'd considered and rejected. She walked them through her thought process, explaining not just what she'd done but why she'd done it, what information had driven her decision, how she'd managed competing risks. Emergency situations are not about heroics, she told them. They're about maintaining clarity, processing information accurately, and making the best decision with the information available. Fear clouds judgment. Training clears it. That's why we train, so that when the real emergency comes, we've already solved it 100 times in our minds. A young female first officer raised her hand. Captain Chen, how did you stay so calm? I would have been terrified. Sarah considered the question seriously. I was terrified, she admitted. But terror and action don't have to occupy the same space in your mind. Fear is a response to danger. Action is a response to responsibility. I chose responsibility. When you've trained for something, responsibility becomes louder than fear. The young officer nodded, and Sarah saw something shift in her expression. The moment she realized that being scared and being capable weren't mutually exclusive, that she could do difficult things despite her fear. That was the real victory. Not the commendation or the media attention or the vindication from her peers. It was this, the knowledge that what she'd accomplished could inspire others to accomplish things they didn't think possible, that her excellence could become a permission slip for other people to demand excellence from themselves. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment and looked at the plaque from the ceremony. She thought about Morrison's apology, about the standing ovation during the ceremony, about the online comments from strangers calling her a hero. And she realized something profound. None of it had changed who she was. She was still the same captain who'd landed that aircraft perfectly because she'd trained for it relentlessly. She was still the same woman who'd stayed silent for 3 years while building her reputation brick by brick. The only thing that had changed was that everyone else had finally caught up to what she'd always known, that she was exactly who she claimed to be the day she'd introduced herself as Falcon. Everything else was just the world recognizing what she'd already proven. 3 years after the emergency landing, Captain Sarah Chen sat in her office at Desert Sky Airways training facility in Phoenix, reviewing applications for the Advanced Emergency Procedures course she'd created. The program had become legendary in aviation circles, a rigorous, intensive training regimen that pushed pilots to their absolute limits in simulation scenarios, teaching decision-making under catastrophic pressure. The course was so demanding that only the most dedicated pilots applied, and Sarah personally reviewed every application to ensure the right mindset matched the technical qualifications. The office around her reflected the journey she'd traveled. On the wall hung the commendation plaque from the airline, but also photographs from her Navy days, flying FA-18 Super Hornets. Her captain's uniform hung in a garment bag. She still flew regional routes twice a week, refusing to become purely administrative despite her expanded responsibilities. And on her desk, in a simple glass frame, was a printed screenshot of the Twitter post that had gone viral, her voice introducing herself as Falcon, juxtaposed against the audio of her calmly landing the damaged aircraft. It wasn't there as a trophy or a reminder of vindication. It was there as a symbol of perseverance, of the gap between what people see and what's actually true, of the power of sustained excellence. The most rewarding part of her job, though, wasn't the training program itself. It was the letters she received from pilots whose lives had been changed by her teaching. One letter came from Amanda Rodriguez, a first officer who'd taken Sarah's first training class. Amanda wrote, "Captain Chen, I wanted you to know that I just passed my captain's exam. 3 years ago, I was ready to quit aviation because I didn't think I belonged in the cockpit. But sitting in your class, watching you teach with the same precision and confidence you showed during the emergency, I realized that belonging wasn't something I needed permission for. It was something I needed to earn through excellence. You taught me that. I'm now the captain of Flight 156, and every single day I fly with the same principles you modeled: preparation, clarity, and responsibility. Thank you." Another letter came from Captain James Mitchell, a senior pilot who'd initially been dismissive of Sarah when she joined the airline. He wrote, "I owe you an apology that goes deeper than the one I gave in person. I held prejudices about women in the cockpit that I didn't even recognize until you challenged them by being undeniably excellent. Now, I actively recruit female pilots and make sure they're treated with the respect you deserved from day one. You changed not just my mind, but my entire perspective on what leadership means. That matters more than any emergency landing." Sarah kept these letters in a folder in her desk drawer. On hard days when she was frustrated with bureaucracy or politics, or the slower-than-expected pace of cultural change in aviation, she read them. They reminded her that the real impact of the emergency landing wasn't measured in news cycles or viral videos. It was measured in the lives of other pilots who'd found permission and inspiration to be better. The Advanced Emergency Procedures course had trained 142 pilots by 2025, and Sarah had personally supervised emergency simulations that stressed pilots to the breaking point. She put them in scenarios where multiple systems failed, where decisions had to be made with incomplete information, where fear and training competed for control of their minds. The failure rate for the course was deliberately high. 40% of applicants didn't complete it, because Sarah believed that if you could handle her training, you could handle anything. But she also invested deeply in each pilot who completed the course. She reviewed their performance metrics, discussed their decision-making processes, mentored them on maintaining excellence. Several pilots who'd been stuck in regional flying had been promoted to major carriers specifically because of their Advanced Emergency Procedures certification. Sarah's training had become a ticket to advancement, a credential that major airlines actively sought. In 2024, Sarah was approached by the FAA with a proposal. Would she be willing to develop a national curriculum for emergency procedures training? The offer was remarkable. It meant that pilots across the country, across airlines, would be trained using her methods, her philosophy, her approach to decision-making under pressure. It would also mean stepping away from Desert Sky Airways, at least partially, to take on a consulting role with the federal government. Sarah's answer surprised everyone, including herself. "I want to do it, but I need one condition. I keep my captain's rating and I continue flying. I need to stay current, to keep flying real aircraft, because I never want to teach something I don't practice. The moment I stop flying, I risk becoming theoretical. I need to remain practical." The FAA agreed. By 2025, Sarah was developing training materials that would be implemented across the entire United States aviation system. Her influence was spreading in ways she'd never anticipated, touching thousands of pilots she'd never meet, changing the culture of how emergency procedures were taught and practiced. But perhaps the most meaningful part of her legacy wasn't the training programs or the certifications or the influence on the FAA. It was the young female pilots who'd written to her, telling her that her story had made them believe they could belong in the cockpit. One email came from a high school student named Maya Patel. "Dear Captain Chen, I'm 17 years old and I want to be a pilot. My parents didn't think it was a realistic goal. They thought I should pursue something more practical. But I watched the video of your emergency landing, and I read about how your colleagues dismissed you, and how you just kept flying, kept improving, kept being excellent until they had no choice but to respect you. That gave me courage to tell my parents that this is what I want, and I'm going to pursue it no matter what anyone says. Thank you for showing me it's possible." These emails, hundreds of them over 3 years, formed the true measure of Sarah's impact. She'd become proof that excellence could transcend obstacles, that quiet persistence could overcome prejudice, that you didn't need permission from the skeptics to pursue your dreams. By 2025, Sarah had also become something unexpected: a public speaker. She accepted invitations to speak at universities, business conferences, and women's leadership events. Her talks weren't about the emergency landing specifically. They were about the philosophy behind excellence, about the relationship between preparation and confidence, about the courage it takes to believe in yourself when others don't. "The Falcon call sign wasn't given to me because I was already excellent," she'd tell audiences. "It was given to me because I committed to being excellent. And then I spent 3 years proving it when people doubted me." That's the actual story. Not one dramatic emergency, but thousands of mundane flights executed with precision. Not one moment of heroism, but years of quiet excellence that nobody noticed. The emergency landing only seemed dramatic because nobody expected someone they dismissed to be so thoroughly prepared. On a Tuesday morning in May 2025, Sarah flew Flight 247 from Phoenix to Denver, the same route she'd flown the day of the emergency. She sat in the captain's seat, feeling the aircraft beneath her, running through pre-flight procedures with the same meticulous attention she'd always given them. Her first officer today was a young woman named Keisha Washington, who was working toward her captain's rating. During the cruise portion of the flight, Keisha said, "Captain Chen, can I tell you something? I signed up to train with you specifically because of your emergency landing. But more than that, I've been reading about your career and I realized something. You didn't become excellent because of that one emergency. You became excellent long before that, and the emergency just showed everyone else what was already true. That's what I'm trying to do now. Build excellence so thoroughly that when a crisis comes, I'm ready." That's the real lesson. Sarah smiled and nodded. Exactly right. Excellence isn't about moments. It's about daily choices, daily commitment, daily refinement. The moment just reveals what you've already built. As the aircraft cruised at 31,000 feet, the same altitude where the emergency had begun, Sarah looked out the window at the endless sky and felt profound gratitude. Not for the fame or the recognition or the validation that had come after the emergency, but for the opportunity to have spent her entire career doing what she loved: flying aircraft and training pilots, building excellence one day at a time. The Falcon had landed that aircraft perfectly years ago. But she was still flying, still teaching, still building her legacy with every flight, every class, every young pilot she inspired. And that legacy, measured not in dramatic moments, but in quiet, persistent excellence, was far greater than any emergency landing could ever be.